President Trump will be in New York City today, not for his so-called hush money trial, but for a rally in the Bronx.
In the case of Samuel Alito, he definitively needs to recuse himself.
I would like to see more focus on community violence, and I would like for them to be very transparent at what they're doing. Show up for your community because your community shows up for you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington, and welcome to America Decides. It is a day of firsts for both presumptive presidential nominees. President Biden praised Kenyan President William Ruto's, quote, bold leadership today. Ruto is the first African leader to be honored with a state visit in more than 15 years. Meanwhile, former President Trump is in New York today, but not for his criminal trial. He is holding a campaign rally of sorts in the Bronx, specifically the South Bronx, and that's where we find our Olivia Rinaldi. Olivia, great to see you. Set the scene for us at this park in the South Bronx. What's going on?
Yeah, good evening, Major. We are here in the South Bronx at this Trump rally. It's a major campaign rally that he's holding in New York City. And it's interesting that we're here today on this Thursday, even though there's no court. See, the Trump campaign had planned to have this rally here tonight on a Thursday when typically Donald Trump would be down at the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. But that didn't happen. Court adjourned earlier this week. The defense rested. And campaign officials tell me that Trump has been golfing today in Westchester, and he'll make his way here later tonight. But the reason why we're here speaks to a broader campaign strategy about expanding the map. The Trump campaign really believes that they can not only win in the 7 battleground states that we typically talk about, but they can expand the map to Minnesota, to Virginia, New Jersey, where he held a rally last weekend, and now New York, where he's holding a rally today. And the South Bronx is particularly notable because it's home to a lot of Hispanic voters and a lot of African American voters. That's crucial. Those are voting blocks that the Trump campaign has seen breaking a little bit their way, that traditionally vote Democratic, but as of lately have been showing some interest in Donald Trump. They're trying to capitalize that tonight here in the Bronx, Major.
So for those of us old enough to remember, Olivia, President Carter went to the Bronx, then Ronald Reagan as president went to the Bronx, then Bill Clinton went to the Bronx. There's a long history of presidents going to the Bronx either to campaign or to point with alarm at what has gone wrong in the Bronx. Is there anything in particular former President Trump wants to say or do to make this South Bronx trip resonate?
We can expect him tonight to focus on a few key things that are central in his campaign, namely immigration. I spoke with a few Hispanic voters earlier today about Trump in general and his rhetoric around immigration, and if that bothers them. They tell me largely not. In fact, my Uber driver, actually, on the way up here, I asked him, what do people in your community say about Donald Trump? He's a Dominican who came here to America, and he told me that overwhelmingly people in his community like Trump and they want to vote for him. He reminds them of leaders back home. So expect him to capitalize on this immigration message that we need to crack down on the border, as we hear New York officials like Mayor Eric Adams talk about immigration being such a key issue in 2024. But not only that, inflation, high rent prices, high grocery prices, all those sorts of things we can expect Trump to focus on here tonight. The campaign says he's going to capitalize on that, knowing that high prices and immigration are something in New York that are interesting to a lot of voters.
Olivia, as you well know, it is always risky business to talk about Trump rallies and crowd sizes. You experienced that firsthand, Wildwood, New Jersey, a week ago. In general, how would you assess the crowd forming for the former president this afternoon?
Look, there's a lot of people here. There's a couple thousand people here. I would say that the permit for today was about 3,500 people, so that we know inside the rally, that is the number of people that will be here. But outside in the park, there are protesters, there are counter-protesters, there are pro-Trump people. They're making it kind of the typical Trump rally scene that we have seen before, which is it's like a carnival. People are out camping, they're out tailgating, they're enjoying, they're talking to each other. It's kind of like a community gathering. That's the sense I got out there. One thing that was different, though, that is different from other Trump rallies, was a little bit more tense outside with those counter-protesters. You normally don't get that when you're in Wisconsin. When I've been in Michigan, I haven't really seen that, but I have seen that here tonight in New York City. A lot of those counter-protesters talking to Trump supporters, yelling at each other in that typical New York fashion that people are so keen to do up here, Major.
New York City, loud and argumentative, but that's the norm, not the exception. Olivia Rinaldi, thank you so much. President Biden said he is working with Congress to designate Kenya as a major non-NATO ally. He made this announcement as part of the state visit of Kenya's president.
Our new global partnership is going to build on all this progress. We're going to meet new challenges with more resources. And it's going to strengthen the security of our countries and our countries around the world.
Nancy Cordes joins us now from the White House. Of course, Nancy, this state visit is about not only things present, but things in the future, using Kenya as a counterweight to China, NATO non-membership, but important. But also, very immediately, Kenya is leading efforts in Haiti, and both presidents talked about that extensively, did they not?
They sure did. And in fact, this entire visit is something of a reward for the president of Kenya, who did step up and offer to send peacekeeping troops to Kenya at a time when many other nations refused and when the U.S. itself felt that it would not be wise to do so. President Biden and President Ruto were actually asked about that repeatedly at a press conference here at the White House today. President Biden, interestingly, said he didn't want it to look like the U.S. was stepping on other nations here in the Western Hemisphere. He felt that if the U.S. had sent peacekeeping troops in, that would cause some anxiety in the region about the big neighborhood superpower getting involved. And so he sort of went in search of other countries that would be willing to send in police and peacekeeping troops, and Kenya answered the call. For his part, the Kenyan president was asked by Kenyan reporters why he was willing to do that, send 1,000 peacekeeping troops to Haiti at a time when Kenya's got its own problems with bandits and gangs, and certainly they're in a tough neighborhood surrounded by other countries that are experiencing unrest as well.
Nancy, the president was also asked about the ICC's suggestion that it would pursue arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. His response.
Super interesting, Major. The International Criminal Court, as you know, earlier this week, a top prosecutor there suggested that he might be seeking to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for crimes against humanity, war crimes, including, he said, possibly using starvation as a weapon of warfare. Official Washington has spoken out against this. The Secretary of State the other day called it extremely wrong-headed to try to compare Israeli leaders and Hamas leaders, and the president echoed that position today. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Made our position clear on the ICC. We don't recognize the jurisdiction, the ICC, the way it's being exercised, and it's that simple. We don't think there's an equivalence between what Israel did and what Hamas did.
Important to note that many countries, including the U.S., China, Russia, Israel itself, don't recognize the ICC's jurisdiction. So it's unlikely that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be let off in handcuffs anytime soon. But the Secretary of State did warn this week, Major, that he thinks that it's possible that these moves by the ICC could ratchet up tensions in the Middle East and make it more difficult to broker a ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians.
Nancy Cordes on the North Lawn, and if your ears were attuned to that, you could hear the fanfare in the background of the state visit of the Kenyan president. Nancy Cordes, thank you very much. For a second time, the Senate today failed to advance a bipartisan bill designed to increase security at the U.S.-Mexico border. Related to that, sources have told CBS News the Biden administration is considering taking executive action to restrict asylum at the border and do so as early as next month. However, Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas told my colleague Camilo Montoya Galvez today that congressional action would still be more effective.
I continue to urge Congress to pass legislation. That is what is enduring. We cannot, through executive action, change the law dramatically, as this legislation does. We cannot, through executive action, resource the Department of Homeland Security, as this legislation does. Administrative action would be no substitute for legislative action.
People around the world are looking to them to be unbiased.
A symbol used by election deniers flown at Justice Samuel Alito's home. Now a second flag, also controversial in its own way, flying at his beach house in New Jersey. What that flag means and what this mess around flags might mean for the Supreme Court. You are streaming America Decides. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito is under increased scrutiny over a second controversial flag. The New York Times reports another flag used by January 6th protesters was seen flying at Alito's vacation home last summer. The flag seen here is known as the Appeal to Heaven flag. It has, in general, been associated recently with a push for a more Christian-minded U.S. government and very strong opposition to left-leaning politicians. The New York Times previously reported an American flag was flown upside down at Justice Alito's Northern Virginia home shortly after the Capitol riots. This became a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement in the wake of the 2020 election. Alito claims his wife flew that flag upside down as part of a dispute with a neighbor that he says he was not involved in. Our Scott McFarland is on Capitol Hill. Scott, were there lots of conversations or just a few about this increasingly hot topic on the Hill today?
For part of this day, this dominated the conversation, Major, and it was a strange stew of reaction. This mixture of Democrats saying they're outraged that there's another flag controversy around Sam Alito, and Democrats acknowledging aloud for all to hear there's not much they can do about it. We talked to Sheldon Whitehouse, the Rhode Island Democrat who's been potentially the most forceful with his criticisms of Justice Alito, and he said, if you want to try to subpoena Justice Alito, if you want to try to pass new ethics rules, you need 60 votes, and he says there's just not a set of 9 Republican votes to be had on this issue. So we are in that phase we like to call the angry letter writing or sternly worded letter phase of the review by Congress. But take a listen to one Republican, John Cornyn, defending Sam Alito today, then Senator Whitehouse after that.
The people who are judges on the Supreme Courts have personal lives, they have families, and I don't think they're necessarily responsible for everything their families do or say. So I know Justice Alito, and I have confidence in him.
I think the question is, how many MAGA battle flags does a Supreme Court justice have to fly until the rest of the court takes it seriously?
Should he recuse? Should he recuse?
Absolutely. Of course he should.
It's worth reiterating the defense Sam Alito gave to that first upside-down U.S. Stop the Steal flag outside his Virginia home after January 6th. Said his wife was doing so amid some dispute with neighbors, that he had nothing to do with it. This new flag, this Appeal to Heaven flag outside his New Jersey home, as reported by the New York Times, Major Sam Alito has not responded to our request for comment, and our review shows he's made no public statements, nor is he required to.
And on that Appeal to Heaven flag, have we seen it in any of the video of January 6th? Has it been referenced in any of the cases related to prosecutions thereof, Scott?
It was recognizable from the videos released by the U.S. Justice Department of some vantage points of some parts of the mob on January 6th. You can see some of those flags, not just amid the mob, Major, but on the front lines, right there outside as the mob approached, they went past police. It has a deep history, that flag and that image. It dates back to George Washington. In fact, the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has one of those flags outside his office. But what Democrats are saying unequivocally today, Major, in the Senate, is that that flag, whatever its history, has new connotations after January 6th because it was a prominent, illustrative part of what was being carried on January 6th. And they say there's going to have to be some explanation from Sam Alito how that type of flag with that type of connective tissue to January 6th would ever be outside any of his homes.
And in that context, Scott, when we're discussing the limitations that you just did of Senate Democrats doing or saying anything that is forceful or has real teeth in terms of subpoenaing a sitting Associate Supreme Court Justice or doing anything to change the ethics rules that apply to that institution, how about the politics of it? Do Republicans feel anything that they have to back away from in terms of these flags or representations that they may make or those who support those flags may make on their behalf?
It's a great question. I brought that same question to Senator Whitehouse earlier, and he said, you know, there may be some political implications as we get closer to November among an electorate that may be frustrated by the Supreme Court's ruling in 2022 overturning Roe versus Wade. But this acknowledgement that they can't really get anywhere through the powers of Congress. They can't even get that subpoena to Justice Alito to have him come answer questions. And I think ultimately, for members of Congress, if they want to make this a campaign issue, they may in the Senate, the Democrats may just have a vote on something about that code of conduct they proposed for the Supreme Court and let there be yeses and nos that they can amplify come November. It's also worth reiterating, Major, the Supreme Court has its own internal code of conduct, but unlike others in the federal government, it's the Supreme Court policing itself.
Scott McFarland, as always, thank you very much. So what is the history around the so-called Appeal to Heaven flag, and why was it flown by those involved and supportive of the January 6th riot? An expert on that subject, Matthew Taylor, joins us next to discuss. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. As we've been discussing, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito is facing scrutiny after the New York Times reported Alito's home displayed a second flag used and embraced and waved by January 6th rioters. Matthew Taylor joins us now. Matthew is a senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. Matthew, it's good to have you with us. Matthew, I want to point out, is also the author of a forthcoming book that explores the Christian movement's ties to former President Trump and January 6, 2021. So, Matthew, the New York Times today quotes you as saying, the Appeal to Heaven flag represents a, quote, theological vision of what the United States should be and how it should be governed. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so this is a Revolutionary War flag. It goes back to the very founding of America. But in 2013, a Christian nationalist leader named Dutch Sheets, he's a leader in a movement that was fairly obscure but has become more and more popular, called the New Apostolic Reformation. He was given one of these flags, and he believed that he received a prophecy when he received this flag, that it was a symbol of a revolution that would take place in America, a spiritual revolution that would reconstitute the United States as a truly Christian nation. And he began spreading this idea. He wrote a book in 2015 called An Appeal to Heaven, and the other New Apostolic Reformation networks that he's a part of. These are vast leadership networks in what is called the independent charismatic world, so the non-denominational wing of Pentecostalism. And these ideas, this meme of this flag has spread in that world rapidly over the last decade until it's become this very potent symbol of Christian nationalism, Christian Trumpism, opposition to abortion, opposition to gay marriage, and a desire for a more Christian America.
And it has been said that Christian nationalism can be viewed either as a slur or a diagnostic. What do you see it as, and can you explain the difference?
I'm a scholar of religion, and so I see Christian nationalism as a diagnostic term. It's just a descriptive term. We talk about Hindu nationalism, Islamic nationalism, Buddhist nationalism. Christian nationalism is just the Christian version of people trying to blend together a Christian identity with their national identity, or their religious identity and their civic identity. And on some level, that's not necessarily a problem for American pluralism, so long as everyone is agreeing to play by the rules. Everyone is agreeing to live by the rules of our democracy. But the Dutch Sheets and the New Apostolic Reformation were heavily involved. They were some of the most important Christian leaders, driving Christians, encouraging Christians to show up on January 6th, to stand in many ways against American democracy, to violate the rules of our democracy. And my worry is that this increasing anti-democratic sentiment has really been festering and growing in evangelical communities that are becoming more radicalized around ideas like the Appeal to Heaven.
Matthew, in this context, can you explain to our audience what the Seven Mountain Mandate is and how it relates to this?
The Seven Mountain Mandate is the underlying political theology of the New Apostolic Reformation. It was an idea coined by a friend of Dutch Sheets, a man named Lance Wallnau. And the idea is that you can divide every society up into 7 spheres: family, government, religion, education, and on. And that Christians are mandated by God to climb the tops of every one of these mountains, the mountain of government, the mountain of education, to hold the high places. And in the framework of the New Apostolic Reformation, those mountains are either controlled by demonic powers and Satan, or by Christians and God. And so there's a battle going on in the spiritual realm and in the real world for Christians to hold supremacy in each one of these 7 mountains. And this was given as a major rationale. Lance Wallnau was one of the first Christian leaders to endorse Donald Trump in 2015, and he has been the leading proponent of this idea. Dutch Sheets is another proponent of the 7 Mountain Mandate, and this is an idea that has spread very quickly. A colleague of mine and I did a survey recently, and we found that more than 50% of American evangelicals agree with this idea of the 7 Mountain Mandate that was an obscure idea originating on the margins of American Christianity 25 years ago, has now become a central feature of American evangelicalism. And it is a radical vision of Christian supremacy.
And before we go, very quickly, Matthew, in that context, you would say a flag, in this instance, isn't just a flag.
Well, in many ways, a flag is never just a flag. It's not a personal decoration. It's not something you put up in your home. It is a signal that you are sending. And my question, and it's a question I don't have an answer to, is who is Sam Alito trying to signal with this flag? And what is he trying to signal? What does it mean to him? Because in the public realm, in the last decade, it has taken on these connotations of Christian Trumpism, Christian nationalism, January 6th, revolution. What does Sam Alito mean with this flag? I don't know, but there's an intentionality to flying a flag in your home that should at the very least be interrogated.
Matthew Taylor, we thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Donald Trump lost New York by nearly 2 million votes in 2020. Question, could he make gains in New York this time around? Well, we're in the South Bronx, as the former president looks to make, if he can, inroads with Hispanic and black voters. You are streaming America Decides.
The Republican victory here in 1980 was no aberration. It marked a turning point in New York politics, and we're going to prove that in 1984.
New York has not voted for a Republican in a presidential election since Ronald Reagan defeated Walter Mondale in 1984. Mondale only carried Minnesota and the District of Columbia back in that landslide defeat. Nevertheless, former President Trump is in the South Bronx, as we reported tonight, for a campaign rally. That is where we find our Robert Costa. Robert, is this an elaborate campaign head fake?
Major, this is a campaign event that's happening here in the South Bronx on a hot afternoon, early evening, because former President Trump has to be in this region. He has to be in this state next Tuesday for his criminal trial, which I've covered from the beginning. So this is a location of necessity. They might try to link it to former President Ronald Reagan and his effort to win New York State, but this is not the New York State of 1980 or 1984. It's a deeply blue state. That being said, there are pockets of conservatism and Trumpism in the New York area. If anyone watching has ever been to Staten Island, they have their own reporting on that. There are Trump voters in New York, and many of them have flocked here today. I see a real enthusiasm here, but this is in no way representative of either the city or the state.
Robert, one of the themes that has come up, and I know the Trump campaign talks about this with some frequency, is the criminal trial in New York and the other cases brought against former President Trump in some respects may speak to longstanding grievances within the African-American community, the Hispanic community, about unfair prosecution. And when the former president talks about it as aggressively and as regularly as he does, that might find some traction. What do you think about that?
As a reporter, I always try to observe what's happening around me. And there's a lot of grievance among those here today, but not a lot of people following the details of this particular trial or the looming federal trials on the horizon. There haven't been protesters outside of the court, pro-Trump or anti-Trump, in any real respect. There have been pockets of them here and there, maybe dozens on some respective days. But this is a group of voters nationwide, whether they're Democrats, Republicans, or independents, who aren't paying close attention to Trump's legal challenges. But to your point, many people share Trump's grievances about the perceived legal and political establishment. I've encountered that here in New York and elsewhere around the country. And that's certainly a current that runs through the Trump campaign. Whether it actually leads to real gains in places like New York or Arizona or Florida, where the Trump campaign is putting an emphasis on winning over voters of color, remains to be seen.
And it is one, of course, the most interesting statistical divide in this campaign right now. President Biden, if the polls are correct, losing support at least initially, among Hispanic and African-American voters, and some suggestion that former President Trump is gaining some ground there. So whether it's strategically important in New York State seems secondary to a larger message the former president's campaign is trying to send, that he is both receptive and might even have a message that resonates.
And you're seeing, Major, in the advertising wars, a battle over black voters. For example, the Biden campaign out today with an ad effectively calling Trump racist. They're saying the former president has been sued over racial issues as a businessman. They played the clip of him remarking about the Charlottesville white supremacist protests, and this is something that we're going to see again and again.
In the South Bronx for us tonight, Robert Costa, as always, thank you very much. Later this hour, we will analyze new CBS News polling on how voters feel about the former president's New York criminal trial. You'll want to stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I want to bring in our political panel, Deepa Shivram and Olivia Beavers. Deepa is a White House correspondent for National Public Radio. Olivia is a congressional reporter for Political. Robert gave us a very good intro. I want to play this advertisement put together by the Biden-Harris campaign. Robert summarized it, but I want you all to take it in yourselves, and then we'll get some reaction on the other side.
Of course I hate these people.
Donald Trump disrespecting black folk is nothing new. He was sued for refusing to rent his apartments to black families and called for the execution of 5 innocent black and brown teenagers.
And it's more than anger, it's hatred.
It's why Trump stood with violent white supremacists, warned of a bloodbath if he loses the next election, and if he's president again, vowed to be a dictator who wants revenge on his enemies.
Deepa, your sense of that ad and what it says about where the Biden-Harris campaign thinks they are and where they need to hope to move them.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think you hear that ad not focusing on like Biden saying, you know, this is what I'm going to do for black voters, right? It is
or what I have done.
Or what I have done, exactly. Right. It is all about Trump. And I think you see that especially in Biden's recent rhetoric, in ads, in the way he speaks on the campaign trail. He wants the attention to be on Trump so people are reminded of what it was like to have Trump as president for 4 years, because there is some memory loss a little bit among a lot of voters, not really recalling or wanting to remember what exactly it was like under a Trump administration. But that, you know, message might not resonate with some voters I talk to who sometimes when they're asked about President Biden, this is black voters I speak with, Latino voters, especially in these swing states, they're kind of sitting there thinking, well, what has President Biden done for me? And they struggle to remember that as well. And so there are things that the Biden campaign is trying to point to. Student debt forgiveness is one of them, reforms on marijuana, for example. But there are not a lot of folks out there who right now are saying, and, you know, I'm seeing that, and I'm putting President Biden's name next to those, what they see as accomplishments.
Olivia, I was on the campaign trail in 2016, and I remember in the aftermath, there was a sense that Hillary Clinton's campaign spent too much time talking about Donald Trump and not enough time talking about her agenda and what she would do. The constant effort to demonize then candidate Trump, Republican nominee, someone new on the political stage, maybe might not have been the best effort. This seems like a kind of a replaying of that. Donald Trump's really bad, and that's what you should remember.
I mean, there's certainly a risk, and I think that it comes as the Biden campaign has some frustration. They've been trying to sell that the economy is doing well, and even when the stocks are rising, Donald Trump is in trial for the hush money trial in court, and he's spending millions of dollars in ads. You're still not seeing a huge change in the polls in these key battleground states where he's, you know, losing or within striking distance to Donald Trump. I think, though, some of this comes from concerns, and the numbers are quite staggering. Pew had numbers out where in 2020, Biden had 92% of the black vote and Trump had 8%. Right now, a couple weeks ago, they had a 57% point difference, with 77% going to Biden and 18% going for Trump. And that was a key coalition for him last cycle. So I think some of this is based off of concern. They're losing that coalition.
Deepa, something happened yesterday that might have fallen into the category of, well, it was eventually going to happen. We were just waiting for it. That is to say, Nikki Haley saying out loud, oh, all those things I said about former President Trump during the campaign, unhinged and not qualified, but I'm going to vote for him anyway. Right. Now the Biden-Harris campaign is saying, well, that may have happened, but we're still going to make a play for Haley voters.
That is right. And I was kind of waiting to see what exactly the Biden side of the situation would look like, because we had seen him even before Nikki Haley came out with her most recent statement, kind of make that strong case to Haley supporters and say, I know that your candidate is no longer in this race, but you should come join our side, which is a really interesting get, because there are a lot of voters who I think are maybe out there who haven't made their decision yet. And a lot of folks we have to keep in mind who are maybe going to stay home and stay out. And that is the voters that I think they are trying to grab and enthuse. That includes Black and Latino voters, young voters for sure, but also some of these folks in the middle here who aren't quite sure where they shake out yet. And so that statement from Nikki Haley probably expected on some level, but to see where those voters go next is going to be really interesting.
Olivia, you spend a lot of time on Capitol
Yes.
Hill talking to lawmakers. It strikes me that Republicans, particularly those who are enthusiastic for former President Trump, speak as if it's almost inevitable that he's going to win this presidential campaign. Do Democrats speak as inevitably about a Biden re-election?
I think they do, but I think the difference is when you actually get them in, a more private setting, and you'll hear Republicans voice frustrations. Sometimes they think they're not going to win the House because they've gotten embroiled in their own internal drama. And Democrats will have concerns too. They'll look at the polling they've seen from Biden and fear that there will be down ballot repercussions. But I think if you talk to both of them, they all say, I think we have a chance. And there is this still optimism that they can pull out. But a lot of things as factors, as we know, are up in the air. The one kind of big question mark is what we were just talking about. Who is Trump going to pick as his running mate? And when I was talking to Republicans on the Hill, they said he needs to figure out who can help him win. He's dismissed the idea of Nikki Haley, but a lot of people are still saying his name, or someone who can attract the same amount of voters, same type of voters that she appealed to.
And Deepa, we say all the time that polls measure the moment.
Right.
They don't capture behavior, they capture attitude, but yet they're still significant, at least in the way strategists and politicians look at the present. And the present situation is Biden down, but Senate Democrats running ahead of him, and solidly so in some of these battleground states. What do you hear about that?
It's one of those things where you talk to a lot of folks and they'll still say it's too early, it's too early, it's too early. We're dealing with two presidential candidates who are pretty wildly unpopular for a lot of reasons. This is not a normal election, which I feel like we keep saying every 4 years, but it is true. And so I think what you hear from a lot of folks, especially on the Biden side, is wait until the fall, wait until after the conventions. It's still too early. People are unhappy with the choices they have on the table. And so when you see other Democrats kind of in the mix, those numbers might be higher because simply their names are not Biden and Trump.
The new normal is abnormal. Deepa Shivram and Olivia Beavers, thank you so very much. Supreme Court has sided with South Carolina Republicans in a dispute over redistricting there. In a 6-3 ruling, the High Court kept the lines of South Carolina's 1st congressional district. A lower court had previously invalidated it as an unlawful racial gerrymander. Republican mapmakers said they used politics and data, not race, when they redrew the district's boundaries. Guilty or not, how would a Trump hush money verdict impact your vote? CBS News pollster Kabir Khanna is standing by to break down the numbers. That's next. You are streaming America Decides. As you are no doubt aware, former President Trump's criminal trial in New York is set for closing arguments next week. Former president says he doesn't believe the upcoming verdict, whatever it will be, will have any impact on the presidential race. A new CBS News poll is revealing more about what Americans actually think about the case, the facts, and what may happen. CBS News Deputy Director of Elections and Data Analytics, Kabir Khanna, joins us now. Kabir, so tell us, what do we know that we didn't know maybe a couple of weeks ago?
Good to be with you, Major. So I want to share 3 quick things from our brand new CBS News poll ahead of jury deliberations next week. The first is that across the country, most Americans believe Donald Trump is guilty of a crime in New York City. One thing I want to emphasize, though, is that not everyone's sure of this opinion. If you look at the top 2 rows here, it's a combined 56% who think Donald Trump's at least probably guilty of a crime, but of course a smaller number, 37%, say that he's definitely guilty. So some uncertainty here, which isn't surprising given that not everyone's following every twist and turn in this case and in this story. The second thing you should know is that views are highly partisan. And maybe that's not very surprising either. So nearly all Democrats say that Donald Trump's at least probably guilty, and of them, most of them say he's definitely guilty. Independents are much more split, and about 8 in 10 Republicans take the opposite view, saying Donald Trump's probably or definitely not guilty. They are a little bit less unified in that position than Democrats are in theirs. And the third thing I want to show you is what people think will happen starting next week. So we asked them, what do you think the jury will decide in this case? Will they convict Donald Trump or acquit him? And the main thing you see is people are a lot less sure about this than they are in their own opinions about his guilt or innocence. So about half the country, if you add the top two rows, 52%, say that the jury probably or definitely will find Donald Trump guilty. But overall, much more people take these middle two positions, saying that they might find him guilty, they might find him not guilty, but they're not entirely sure, Major.
Excellent. As always, Kabir Khanna, we thank you very, very much. Lawmakers in Louisiana have approved a bill that would classify 2 abortion-inducing drugs as controlled and dangerous substances. The state Senate approved the first-of-its-kind bill despite widespread criticism from doctors. The legislation now heads to the desk of Republican Governor Jeff Landry, who has expressed support for it. It's been 4 years since a Minneapolis police officer murdered George Floyd, but after the protests and the proposals for police reform, has anything genuinely changed on Capitol Hill? Our Tareen Small is in Minneapolis. He'll join us next on America Decides.
Chiefs in this room know that when their communities trust the police, we can solve a hell of a lot more crimes a hell of a lot faster. I'm going to continue to call on Congress to pass the George Floyd Policing and Justice, the Justice and Policing Act, so we can make police reform the law of the land.
Saturday marks 4 years since the murder of George Floyd. Since that crime, partisan disagreements here in Washington have stalled the efforts to pass national police reform legislation. Back in 2021, the then democratically controlled House passed the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, but that legislation has stalled in the United States Senate. Our Torian Small joins us now from George Floyd Square in Minneapolis. Torian, be so kind and walk us through what this House-passed George Floyd Justice and Policing Act would do and its problems in the Senate.
Major, I think the biggest component of that bill would be to take a look at how accountability is really focused in policing. A lot of, and this is a sticking point for Republicans, a lot of Democrats are looking to target qualified immunity among officers, so they're looking for provisions through legislative action in order to do so. This bill would also require federal law enforcement agencies to require body-worn cameras. They would also provide incentive and even some penalties for local and state law enforcement agencies if they don't also buy into making sure that all of their officers are equipped with body-worn cameras. But again, this major sticking point with Republicans, which is why we've seen efforts or progress on that bill stymied, as Republicans aren't looking to change what is now in place, which is qualified immunity for many law enforcement officers around the country.
And Torian, remind our audience what qualified immunity is, why police departments want to keep it, and why Republicans are in general siding with them.
It's insurance that when police are the target of complaints or issues by members of the community, that they won't necessarily be targeted directly through civil action. So police departments, the city typically is who would pay out in these criminal or civil complaints from members of the communities to police departments or law enforcement officers. There again, qualified immunity, going after qualified immunity would, in Democrats' minds, as they look to move forward with this legislation, would make sure those who are at the center of this misconduct are held accountable.
Right, so the difference would be without qualified immunity, there might be personal financial liability for an offending officer. As it stands now, there is only liability that is paid for and financed by the city or entity representing the city, correct?
Correct. And it goes beyond that, too. I mean, this is just another plea for or play at making sure these officers are held accountable. Typically, what I've been hearing neighbors say is that when there comes to a police or officer-involved shooting, a lot of officers are placed on paid administrative leave, sometimes administrative leave, and then the fear there is that even if the department internally finds them guilty of some type of misconduct, they could then leave and go to another force. Holding them accountable financially, but also ensuring that there is some type of protection where that record would follow them is what they're looking to come through in this bill as well.
And the debate will continue in Washington. Torian Small joining us from Minneapolis. We thank you. Ahead of this Memorial Day weekend, a special bipartisan conversation with two members of Congress, both veterans, about the importance of public service. Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan sat down with Representatives Mike Waltz, a Republican, and Pat Ryan, a Democrat, at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial earlier today. They reflected on their own military service and the world that young military members are entering.
President Biden is going to speak up at West Point this Saturday. Given the threat environment we are looking at, given the instability, what are those cadets graduating into?
Yeah, and 20 years ago I sat on that same field we were headed into war at that time in 2004. And you think about the gravity for these young men and women, patriots, who are signing up now for a very dangerous world. More than anything, I hope the president just acknowledges that they have stepped up and their families, and that we need more people to do it, that we have their backs, that we are going to build the strongest, most lethal fighting force to prevent and deter wars, because it's so dangerous right now. So I think that we'll hear that from him. But most importantly, it's also just a time to celebrate those young people that every time I represent West Point now. And so every time I go, I feel better about our country. And to your question, can we change it? We can. We're going to change it. We are going to manifest a country where people put country above party, country above self, but we have to ask people to participate in that, put out that call, and lead by example.
What do you think he needs to say to those young men and women?
Well, President Biden, of course, is going to honor these young men and women who are willing to step up and devote their lives to service. But I also hope he sends a message out to our adversaries and to our enemies. Iran is on the march. We're seeing an unholy alliance between China and Russia. We frankly have our allies that are not doing enough in our view to contribute to Ukraine and to 2% of their national defense. Right now, only 11 of 31 NATO allies are contributing, with World War II, World War III on their doorstep. If they're not going to do it now, when are they? So our adversaries, our enemies, need to respect and to fear us. That is how deterrence works and keeps the peace. And those officers need to know that they are going to be the best trained, best equipped, and best led military in the world with unprecedented threats that they're facing.
You can watch more of this conversation on Face the Nation this Sunday right here on CBS News 24/7 at 12 p.m. Eastern. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides Tuesday after Memorial Day at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.